Bob Murphy Show, episode 380.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bob Murphy Show. Today I am interviewing Fergus Hodgson, who is the author of Latin America Red Pill. So in the discussion, I give him a chance to give some of his background and what he's doing with the book. As the title suggests, it's giving you the uncomfortable truth from his perspective about the prospects for liberty and economic freedom, more specifically in Latin America. But to tell you here just a little bit about his background, he is the director of Econ Americas and publisher of the Impunity Observer. He has an MBA in finance from Rice University, a BA in economics from Boston University, and a BA in political science from the University of Waikato. And anything else you need to know about his background and the relevance to the book, we go over explicitly in the discussion. So I will now transition to that. Hope you like it. Fergus, welcome to the Bob Murphy Show.
My pleasure to be with you, Bob.
So we're here to discuss your book, The Latin America Red Pill. But before we dive into the contents, can you just give a brief background explanation, you know, where you come from and what took you to Latin America and so forth?
Sure. Yes, I'm Kiwi born, so New Zealand born. I came to the United States on an athletic scholarship, and I became obviously very interested in the U.S. political life, history, way of thinking. And I came across many classical liberal organizations, Foundation for Economic Education being one of them in particular. And I became almost basically a lifelong promoter of classical liberalism or laissez-faire capitalism. And I've worked for many think tanks in Canada and the United States. I've published widely. I'm now basically an economics lawyer. I'm an economics author. And that is, I'm trying to think how to round that off. I live in Colorado these days. And my latest book is The Latin America Red Pill, which references or explains about 15 years of writing about exploring Latin America, including a couple of years living there and visiting almost every country. Why I went there, basically, when I was a younger man, I was looking for a new place to explore, to find maybe a new place to make a home. And I thought maybe it would be an opportunity. It would be a cheap, what we all hear the advertisements, basically a lower cost of living, different way of life, less intrusive government, whatever it may be. And so I explored Latin America for that purpose.
Okay. And you were telling me offline. So it's a collection of essays, some of which were previously published, but some which were written specifically for this book. Is that right?
Yeah. So I actually planned this book about 5 years ago, and I got distracted by another book project. But I basically had a chapter outline, and I would write articles to fit the book and publish some of them. But then I had maybe half a dozen that only appeared in the book. Yeah.
Okay. And so we're going to obviously, folks, just go through some of the chapters and let Fergus, and we'll discuss it. But yeah, big picture, why is it the red pill? What was the shocking realization or the thing that took you, the difficult truth, but by gosh, you had to know the truth?
Yeah, great question, Bob. And the challenge we face is that as outsiders looking at Latin America, we get the perspective provided to us by legacy or regime media and the academic community. And my personal view is those accounts are misleading. They present a victim narrative and a leftist narrative. And when I went to live there, I basically found an explanation and a debate that is going on that is basically unknown to the Anglosphere. And so what I say, it's a red pill to people going there, but to a minority of Latin Americans, especially the business class, it is not a red pill. They basically are aware of this. And so let's say the underlying assumption that many people have about Latin America is that Latin America's poverty or challenges are the consequence of Spanish colonialism or American imperialism. And I flip that and say, in fact, they are bottom up. They're that they need to look in the mirror rather than blame outsiders.
Okay. So how do you want to proceed? Like, do you think there's a good essay we could start on that you could summarize that might be a good entree into that?
Yeah. So one of the chapters that is not appeared outside of the book is just the introductory one, right? So I give 5 observations, right? So I'm not sure people are watching this on video, but this is the book, The Latin America Red Pill. And so the first chapter in the observation section, so there are 3 sections: observations, explanations, and conclusions, is Colombia to Chile by bus. So back in 2010, I just bought a one-way ticket to Colombia and bussed all the way from there down to Chile, exploring, and spent plenty of time in Ecuador. And I tried to, for the book, I tried to take that journey and tease out the most important elements. So these observations suggest a need for explanation, you might say. So in terms of crime, I note that, so we all have a sense that Latin America is different. I tried to be more precise about that. So I said, okay, we have crime. Officially, if you go by, official numbers or reports, Latin America has about 5 times the murder rate of Anglo-America, Canada, and the United States. And my personal view is that it's probably much higher than that, given a lack of reporting. Then I note poverty, that Latin America is about 85% poorer in terms of GDP per capita. If you do a weighted average of the countries. Class division, there's higher inequality, and this manifests in many different ways. Anti-capital, that there is much less of a respect for or understanding of both private property and constitutional or classical liberal government. And then low trust, that the region suffers, and low trust is almost an outcome of the previous 4, to be frank, that the people do not trust each other, and that makes economic development incredibly difficult. So, I was trying to basically explain why is Latin America struggling so much, and what are, let's say, the politically incorrect explanations for that you won't hear elsewhere, and how I came to these over an extended period of time. I worked as a think tank researcher and then an editor-in-chief of a publication covering Latin America. I mean, I went and lived in Argentina for a year, Guatemala for more than a year, almost 2 years. So I really explored this in a direct fashion. I also studied Cuban history at the University of Miami for a period. So it was, and people might say, it was almost like an obsession of an intellectual obsession. And I've got the experience that few in the Anglosphere really have. And it's difficult to convey in words because a lot of it was just personal observation that was jarring at the time, to be frank.
Okay, so big picture is that there are certain ways in which Latin America is lagging, and the standard explanation, it's the legacy of colonialism or U.S. imperialism. And,
exploitation.
And you're saying that, no, from your observation, there were things, and partly like low trust societies, and also I know I've read things about just like the regulations and stuff you have to do in order to start a business are crazy, and you got to, like, it's just a matter of fact that you got to pay off all these different government bureaucrats to get anything done, and it's just accepted that like what we would call political corruption is really high. Again, we're brushing with broad strokes.
So I should say, and as you said, is with broad strokes, because there is a great deal of complexity or variation along the countries. And people who live in Latin America, yes, they would consider themselves Latino, but they don't, not first and foremost. They would think of themselves in terms of their own nationality, right? Mm-hmm. It's a bit like referring to Europeans. If I'm from Ireland, I would think of myself as Irish, not as a European person, right?
Right.
And so there is a great deal of variety. However, from the outsider's perspective, there is a lot of commonality in terms of, yes, there is a shared ethnic lineage, you might say, of mestizos and Amerindians. and there is also the legal system bestowed by the Spanish. So there's a lot in common also. So it's not an accident that when they come to the United States, they will join the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce or something like that and feel some kinship. Yeah.
Maybe I don't know if this is too out of left field, no pun intended, but like, is Che Guevara a hero among those people the way he is among leftists in America, or not necessarily?
Actually, more so. So there will be statues of guys like Che Guevara in many places. Yeah, it's a little bit hard for us to comprehend or accept, but people like Fidel Castro actually celebrated greatly. That lots of politicians will promote him because they have this David versus Goliath, or perception of him, that he's fighting the big bad Americans, or some kind of Robin Hood branding of him. It's crazy to me because I just think he was a psychopath who destroyed a country, but he was effective at spreading a message that was appealing to many people who, in my view, the people who are most attracted to it have almost an inferiority complex and want to, it's a bit like the socialist narrative in general, that they want to redistribute away from those who are successful. And that's why, so a minority of Latin Americans, those who are involved with groups like Students for Liberty, or there's the Foundation for Intellectual Responsibility. There are all these aristocratic groups, the more power in society, that are active in Latin America that would obviously not share that view, but they're in the minority.
Right.
It's not an accident that people like Hugo Chavez were actually elected democratically.
Well, I was going to just bring him up because I've seen clips, older clips of Castro, like especially after the Bay of Pigs, and like standing up heroically to the big bad U.S. and speaking defiantly, and people were worried about him. Like the clip I saw, the details of this might be a little off, but the spirit of this is correct. Where it was, they were asking him, like, shouldn't you be going around with body armor or a bulletproof vest or something, given that the U.S. is and he said, like, no, I have a vest of righteousness or something like that. And then also Hugo Chavez, I remember when he was giving a talk somewhere, I don't know if it was the UN or something, and it was after George Bush had been there, and he was saying, I can still smell the sulfur up here, like saying that, Bush is from the devil and that kind of, anyway. So I can understand how, if you're a progressive leftist and anything that's bad in those countries, you can just easily blame on U.S.,
absolutely,
sanctions and other stuff behind the scenes. A lot of things that I actually wouldn't agree with in terms of U.S. foreign policy.
Sure.
And so it'd be easy to say. Briefly, I had a roommate when I went to NYU who was a film student at NYU, and she was an outright Marxist, and she was so excited because she was going to go take a trip to Cuba. And I was more combative at the time, and I said something to her like, well, when you see how poor it is, that's the fault of socialism, not the embargo. And she of course thought the opposite, that no, anything that I see that's bad, it's going to be the U.S.'s fault. So anyway, it provides a good way that they can explain their failures. Do you want to respond to any of that? I know I was just
So that's one of the let's say fundamental challenges that a book like mine faces, is that pleasant myths spread faster than unpleasant truths, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of people want to believe that Cuba is poor because of the embargo, even though the fact is that the U.S. is still the major trading partner with Cuba, and there are so many carve-outs to the embargo that include medicine and food and all sorts of other things, and that Cuba can trade with any other country on the planet. But it's just they want to believe it, right? People want to believe that it's tougher to accept that, the socialist or communist experiment was a disaster, and it's destroyed a country, and that even to this day, millions are leaving. Apparently 1 million have left in just the last year or two. So they tried to sneak in, I think, before Biden got out of power. But so, not sneak in, I mean, get asylum, whatever you want to call it. But they thought it would be more amenable. So that, and this is, I must admit too, Bob, that this is somewhat sensitive to me too. It's beyond just an intellectual interest, because many of my very best friends are exiles. A great mentor and intellectual man I admire is Marco Navarro Gini. He fled as a teenager the communist revolution in Nicaragua. And so I've seen the pain that has caused. A gentleman who mentored me from Venezuela was one of the aristocratic business people. He supported me originally with my work, and he just has lived in Miami for the last 20 odd years or 25 years now. And he's sad that his family, who were in Venezuela for centuries, have been kicked out, and his children are Americans now. So I've seen the pain firsthand. Another great mentor, I mentioned him in the book, Jose Azel from Cuba. He's never went back to Cuba. He left when he was, I think, 10 years old. So many people's lives have been destroyed by this communist menace. And I try to make that clear as clear as possible in the book. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I have to ask you, because I know the audience is going to be wondering, do you have any thoughts on Javier Milei?
Yeah, I'm a big fan. I'm so pleased it's happened. I was surprised that he got elected. Argentina is different within Latin America. People will, they will tell you themselves, but it has much more of a classical liberal intellectual tradition than the other parts of the continent. And I know many of these people personally. So there were a lot of people preparing doing the groundwork for him to get elected. And there was a previous classical liberal or libertarian candidate who also brought the message in a previous election, who'd kind of prepared the way for Javier Milei. I am somewhat, this is the problem when you read from the United States or outside, you'll get these tidbit headlines and not really know what's going on. Because I've lived in Argentina, I know the deep challenges that he will face and how many, let's say, embedded corrupt actors there are. So I'm less optimistic than other people, not because I doubt him. I just realize it's a tough challenge. Mm-hmm. When I was there, I went to a Sunday afternoon barbecue, which is the tradition there, with a bunch of these classical liberal, or they just say the liberal community. And they were asking me, could Argentina achieve what New Zealand did in the 1980s, which was a rapid market liberalization? And I was not optimistic about it. Javier Milei is trying. I said the big problem they face is that they have a much more embedded union class of people. They call them sindicatos. And then they also have a provincial legislative system. So you don't just have a central government as in New Zealand. There's just one, because we're only 4 or 5 million people. But it's more like the United States, where the actual federal government has a much harder time because there are all these lower level governments that will try to get in your way. Okay,
yeah. That dovetails what you're saying with what I know from people in Central and South America that are Austrian economists or libertarian types, just letting me know, like, when Milei, I'm trying to think of an example, like when he was pro-U.S. on certain things, and some anti-war U.S. libertarians were wondering why, and some people were telling me that if you understood the politics in Argentina, like by him being pro-U.S., that's the same thing as signaling I am for capitalism. Like that's what that means, and so they were just trying to explain, like if he got as nuanced and nitpicky as some of these U.S. libertarians want, his supporters wouldn't even realize he was on what he was for. So anyway, that was kind of the way they were trying to explain it to me, that some of the stuff is just, you need to understand the political arguments to even get what does he mean when he says something that then when you translate it into English, you might say, oh, gee, I don't know if I support that.
Yeah, Bob, we actually crossed paths. I was living in Argentina when you came and spoke at Rosario at the Austrian Economics conference there. Mm-hmm. But you're right. When you are familiar with the challenges of the third world, and I guess Argentines would resist taking that moniker, but let's say a developing nation or a nation with challenges, you are much less nitpicky, right? You just want to see, like, in the right direction, please, for the love of God. Like, can we just not have a socialist revolution? Yeah.
Okay, so what do you think? I had jotted down. Do you want to do borders now? Is that a good?
Yeah, we can go for it. It's one of the more controversial elements of the book, because I have written, even in libertarian publications, in favor of open borders, and strongly so. And I must admit that because I'm an international man, I've got 3 citizenships, and people might dislike me. All these nationalists would say I don't have loyalty to one nation, but I'm international. And I basically, especially when I was younger, resisted the whole idea of citizenship, that I didn't want to have to submit to this. I wanted to live wherever, and I felt like it was an artificial impediment. And I even got published in many outlets on this topic, whatever. So, but it took me many years to realize that just as you and I might be in our heart of hearts anarcho-capitalists and think the state is obsolete and we should just move on towards, I don't know, a Liechtenstein style of government, that's just not where the world is.
Go
and and I also realized that you and I think you grew up in New York State, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you and I grew up with we enjoyed, let's say, the blessings of a relatively high trust society, and I especially did in New Zealand. And over time, by traveling, I realized that that is really the exception to the rule around the world, and that if you have a high trust society, it's something worth protecting, to be frank. And I don't see how that can continue with an open border scenario, unfortunately. As much as I believe in freedom as strongly as anybody, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And I realize, too, that in the case of the United States, and I make this clear in my book, that just enforcing the laws, I don't know, the laws don't necessarily make a lot of sense. So it's a very messy scenario in the United States. It would make more sense in a country that has a more cohesive community. But the basic point is that if you live in a first world nation with high trust and certain values such as free speech or gun rights or whatever it may be, if you just let the world end, those values or behaviors will be lost swiftly, because that's just not the way the rest of the world works. And also, it just is a fact that the Western world grew in a very incremental way, given relatively superior institutions. And those are exactly what Latin America does not have. And it's just the case, and I've unfortunately witnessed this too much, even just firsthand, that especially because Latin Americans are the ones who in the last, 40 odd years led the immigration to the United States, they bring their cultural habits with them. And I think I'm concerned about it, to be frank. And I must admit that a lot of the, let's say, MAGA Hispanics would share my view, that they're very aware of it. The lady who's most famous for this is Valentina Gomez, who did not get elected to Missouri, but is running for I think, Congress against, what's his name now, the guy with only one eye in Houston. Anyway, so she became famous recently.
Yeah, I know you mean, and I'm blanking on the
Yeah, she's gone viral across all the different platforms that got banned from Instagram, but she's a Colombian lady who basically wants the death penalty or the firing squad for all these illegal rapists or drug dealers or what have you. And she got into a tussle with the Colombian president on Twitter because he's a former Marxist terrorist himself, unfortunately, and he called her a fascista, and she spat right back at him, his legacy. So she's one of these, let's say, these Latin Americans who would agree with my book and would say we just cannot let this kind of society in, basically. Not that's too broad of a term. We cannot just have this unchecked, open immigration.
Okay. And did I understand you right that when in the younger days, like, you would have been more open board, like, oh no, just free movement of goods and free movement of labor, and everybody's an individual, and that kind of thing?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, because I even wrote to, what's his name now, Brian Kaplan, years ago, that because I saw him in a debate, I said, if you would like another debate, I'll come and be your debate partner, because I'd written on it so frequently, and I also believed in it so greatly. And to be fair, I never want to say that these men are lacking in intelligence or anything like that. He's obviously a very sharp man, and I assume he's been on your show. I'm guessing. I don't know.
Yeah.
But,
He'd to even talk about borders, among other things. Yeah.
So he's a very sharp man, no doubt about it. And I really enjoyed his book, The Case Against Education, for example. And I was aware of his arguments about open immigration. And like I said, to be charitable to him, there are many great points. That it is a fact that the arbitrage opportunity from a third world to a first world nation for labor is huge. So that means you're always going to have a tough time defending the border. It's going to be an expensive proposition. Yeah. So I'm not saying it's an easy topic. I just realize that there's a small portion of the world has enjoyed relative civility and peace and low crime and the like. And that just will not stand if you let anybody in. That's basically my view. And that I do believe there's a problem that, unfortunately, some issues are too hot to handle in the academic sphere. And one man who's pushed against this is Garrett Jones with his books, Hive Mind and The Culture Transplant. He's sort of carefully bring these more sensitive issues to the academic world, but it is not easy. And I fear that is one bias of the academic world that leaves them in a more difficult position when addressing these topics.
Yeah, I interviewed Garrett on one of his books on that issue as well. And it was so. I don't know that I've ever said this, but I noticed I would occasionally go over to Europe for what was called the Free Market Roadshow.
Sure.
And I just would interact with a lot. And the way it worked out was the scheduling. And this is when I was based at Texas Tech. I usually was like on the where we were hitting Eastern European, that leg of the trip, or the tour or the show, I guess is what it was. And this, I don't know, this was what, 10 years ago, something like that. But anyway, it was just talking to the people over there and how they were talking about immigration, because this was an issue like when it was really picking up, where a lot of migrants were coming in, and then there was an issue like if one country let them in, and then if like all the other countries had like relative open borders with each other, if there was like 1 weak link, then all of a sudden people were coming in and getting all kinds of benefits and stuff because they got into and the way they were talking, and it was like making me uncomfortable, just because it wasn't what they were saying there was anything wrong about it, but it was just in U.S. circles, like we've been trained that, you can't talk like that. Like that's just automatically racist, even though what they were, they weren't saying anything that was objectively immoral or something. It was just, so I got the sense that, depending on where you are, it's just people have more latitude to discuss things. Whereas, like you said, in the United States, like it's been hammered home that no, you can't say, well, gee, if we just had completely open borders, wouldn't we just be overrun by criminals or whatever? Like you say, you can't talk like that. That's racist. So anyway.
Well, we're going to get a tough lesson in this, because you must have seen the viral videos from Aurora, Colorado, which is just about 40 minutes from me, of Tren de Aragua, this Venezuelan gang that's basically coming and taking over parts of the United States. And we'll learn that this sort of behavior it just happens all the time in Latin America. We're going to get a quick lesson in how not talking about issues is not going to help us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. So, and I had Dave Smith on the Human Action podcast, just sort of giving his story sounded similar to yours, that he said, when I first got into libertarianism, I thought borders are just arbitrary lines on a map that a bunch of state bureaucrats draw, and who are they to? But now he's evolved on that, and he thinks that he's like in the Hoppian line of thinking, private property, and then if the state comes in and basically allows the movement of people that we don't think would be an outcome, and if all that real estate were privately controlled, then that's government intervention, and it's not the same thing as being analogous to free trade. So.
Yeah, and it's just tricky too, Bob, because I was just like you. I guess I was raised to be ethnically blind, but my work as a journalist I couldn't ignore the fact that there were basically ethnic tensions, right? Mm-hmm. And this was especially when I came to the United States, that I was working in New Orleans, and I just got a rude awakening, basically how ethnicities were grouping and targeting each other, and it just really broke my heart, to be frank, because I didn't want to make that worse or exacerbate it with my reporting, but it was difficult to ignore. So that's one of there's icky topics in the book, where I discuss my experiences in New Orleans, Louisiana, and Houston, Texas, and just the difficulty I had with recognizing that other groups literally form ethnic affinity groups and lobby for themselves. And I never had even thought about that growing up, right? That it wasn't an issue really in New Zealand, although it's more of it these days.
So you kind of mentioned it in passing, but I think some people might be interested. You mentioned earlier how you have, is it citizenship in 3 countries? Is that what you said?
Yes. Yeah.
Can you just elaborate? Like, is it more of an economic thing? Like you just want to be agile, or is it, anyway, do you want to just elaborate on that? Like, is that just your way of life?
No, I was lucky that I was born in New Zealand, but I had a mother from Canada. She was the firstborn to Irish immigrants. They had children in England, and then too many, and they'd moved to Canada for better prospects. Ironically, that was 70 years ago, of course, so things have changed a lot. But so I just, through inheritance, I received 3 passports, although I must admit that now I really like that flexibility. And I also have a green card to live in the United States. But because, especially if you care about your liberty, having jurisdictional options is huge. It is great that I don't have to put up with as much, right? I can move to other places, and I realize now that other people just don't have that luxury that I enjoy. Yeah. And even just having a Canadian passport, for example, means I can come and be a student here with no visa. I mean, it makes life a lot simpler. Now, I'm not saying all this is coherent or makes sense or is just, but yes, it does help a lot. And also, even just having an Irish passport, because my grandparents were both born and grew up there, I can live in all the United Kingdom. It really does give it an advantage. So if you are concerned about your jurisdiction, getting second or third passports, it does help you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I've been at conferences where, like, some people may know the sovereign man, Simon Black. And it was funny. I was getting ready to give a talk, and the organizer of the event, I was talking to him, and then Simon walked, and he said, "Oh, hey, Bob, this is Simon, and Simon, this is Bob." And I was, "Oh, hey,
Yeah.
And it didn't click with me who he was. Like, I knew of him, but he wasn't introduced to me as the sovereign. You know what I mean? And the guy just said, "This is my buddy," and so it didn't click. And I'm just making conversation. I was like, "Oh, where are you from?" And he was just kind of like, "Oh, I'm kind of around," Like,
he's American.
But I know,
He's
but
American.
it was funny how, like, I could tell, he realized, oh, this guy doesn't know who I am. You know what I mean? Because that's his whole shtick, that he's from all over. That you got to be mobile and have multiple passports. So anyway, I'm just saying that there is, especially like people who are multi-millionaire level, CEOs and stuff and are concerned about individual liberty. That's a thing now where you want to have multiple passports because you got to be ready to go because you don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, although there's one other chapter in the book which is important, and it's what there's nowhere to flee to, I think, is the headline. Basically, the subtitle is "The Land of the Free is Still the Place for Liberty." I've got it in here. Americans have nowhere to escape to. The third world's superficial appeal does not beat the land of the free. So my personal view is that, yes, it is great to have these passports, but I'm much less of a fan of the Simon Black sovereign man ideal. My personal view is that it's just a marketing ploy. And I don't blame him personally. There's demand, right? People want to read about and they fantasize about these ways of life. But as someone who has lived to some degree in that fashion, I don't think it is healthy. I don't think it's productive. Most of the people who try this have probably mental health issues by not having a stable home or a good community. And so I don't advocate for just moving around permanently. I think it's for very few people. Very few people could handle that productively or fruitfully. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. Let's see. What about? So is that the pet chat? Because you mentioned a chapter on expatriation. Is that the same thing, or is that a different?
I've got a couple of chapters on expatriation. So I discuss what it would be like to go to El Salvador, right? Because recently, and a lot of libertarians have jumped on this bandwagon, the Salvadoran president, Nayib Bukele, promoted, I think it was 5,000 or 6,000 citizenships for outstanding scientists or scholars or whatever. And so I wrote a chapter about that. When would that actually make sense? And my basic view is that the people who it would make sense for would tend to be the exiles from other Latin American countries. So like my friend in Canada, who's an exile from Nicaragua, he obviously already speaks the language. He would just fit in right away. And he's got a PhD in political science or history, I think, from the University of Calgary. But that sort of person it would make sense for. But the idea that a gringo or Yankee would go down to El Salvador and find more freedom and more opportunity, to me, is insane. It's crazy. Yeah.
Okay, and is that? Can you elaborate on the, like, so the people who think otherwise? I'm just trying to get into the head. Like, so one thing is stuff like cost of living or whatever. Like, especially if you're earning your revenue online or something, and then if you could just relocate to a place that's cheaper. Are you conceding that point and just think, but you just wouldn't be as happy, or do you mean in other ways as well?
There are many. This is the challenge with assessing the quality of life, and you might even want to have this gentleman on your show. But about 20 years ago, I read a great book called "The Sum of Our Discontent" about why statistics make us irrational. And what he was getting at is that the best things in life are not easily measured, right? The taste of a good steak or the affection you have with a good friend or whatever it may be. You cannot measure these things. And so we can typically measure the cost of rent easily, right? So yes, it is true. If you move from Miami and let's say you've got a 1-bedroom apartment there for $2,000 a month, and you go to Guatemala City, it might cost $800 a month, right? So you're going to more than halve the cost of living, right? And also in Guatemala City, there is no tax on foreign income, so you can basically skip all taxes if you've got an LLC in the United States, right? So for many people, this is actually pretty appealing, and you can see why they would want to do it. However, you've got to think of the broader picture. If you were to try to enjoy, so why do all Latin Americans flock to Miami? Then you think, if it's so great in Guatemala, why are they all leaving, right? And they already speak the language; they're already part of the culture. Why would we go in opposite directions? It's very confusing. And revealed preferences tell the tale that, people from, let's say, Honduras is a country I know very well and has a great deal of the migrants coming north to the United States, right? Why don't they just stop and go to Costa Rica, or why don't they go to, why don't they go in the opposite direction, or they could go to other places. Why don't they just stay in Mexico, right? They want to go to the United States. They don't believe in, they have confidence in the U.S., let's say, system better than their own. And so what tends to happen? So let's just look at, let's say we have some rational behavior. Who actually does move to a place like El Salvador? It will tend to be, yes, online workers and young people and hippies and retirees and a particular portion of the population for which it might make sense, right? But they will tend to form, ironically, enclaves with other expats where they speak English and try to rebuild the United States, right?
Right.
So you think, what? It doesn't make a lot of sense. And the truth is, too, that if you want to live like you did back in the United States, it's probably going to be just as expensive. Because let's say I want to get ground bison, right? Here in Colorado, I just go to the supermarket, $9 a pound or whatever. Do you think I can get that in Guatemala? Forget it, right? Or let's say I want to buy a rowing machine. I can buy one online in the US for $1,000. It'll cost easily twice that much. It might take weeks to get there. Then at the border, they'll try to scam me for taxes, right? So you realize there are many impediments that are not on the surface. And also, what tends to happen is that the children of these immigrants, in my experience, now people might debate this with me, but they will tend to want to come back to the United States.
Okay, yeah. I mean, you're right. Certainly, you wouldn't move to Guatemala to be a waiter because then your standard of living was so. But yeah, if you had an exit or you had some ongoing business activity that you could do online, like I can understand the arbitrage. But you're right. The reason people selling their labor for money move from Central America to the U.S. is because they get paid more in the United States. Their labor is worth more.
I mean, because this is where many Americans don't realize the difference that. If you're getting paid $1,000 a month in a place like Guatemala, you are upper middle class. You are doing well, right? So it's a different world, right? I give one example from Honduras, which is a neighbor to Guatemala. Last year, there was a bit of a scandal where Cuba sent about 100 doctors to Honduras as some kind of, public relations, international relations stunt. And they were getting paid $2,000 a month, so $24,000 a year. These are medical physicians, okay? Now, we might think, gosh, that is pennies for a full doctor, okay? What do you think the Hondurans felt about that? They were angry because their doctors get paid $1,100 per month. That's the world of perceptions. And so, yes, it's true. If you are an entrepreneur or a homeschooling family or something, you can make it work, but are your children never going to have a regular job? Are they only going to be entrepreneurs, right? And typically they're going to want to sell their products to Americans anyway. So you're never going to lose that connection because the Americans have the purchasing power. And so, like I said, the expatriation idea to me is more a business than a practical reality. And now there are some exceptions. So there's a place in Mexico called San Miguel de Allende. You might know of it. And after World War II, there was some kind of, I think, art or some kind of school down there that somehow got eligible for U.S.-funded scholarships so the veterans could go down there and study. And so basically over, 70 or 80 years now, they have built a little piece of America in Mexico. and it's oddly developed and safer.
Okay, yeah, all good points, and you're right. There is a certain allure and mystique around, and I've seen like the guys selling real estate and stuff making the pitch. Belize is another popular one.
Oh, have you been to Belize?
Oh yeah, a few times.
Yeah. Okay, so someone recently was having trouble getting to Belize. I don't know whether it was you, someone I saw on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, describing the story. But let's also think of people who've done this in a more, let's say, careful and methodical. Actually, this doesn't really apply to the Gold Skulls Chile, but there was a major movement of libertarians to Chile. I'm sure you followed this back at the time. And it was
the Gold Skulls thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Gold Skulls Chile, a huge disaster. But what happened is that a few of the people who were working on Gold Skulls Chile, who were not part of the theft and just silly behavior, they went and found another place in Chile called Fort Galt, right? Another property development. And their story is even more revealing, to be frank, because they did nothing wrong. And I know them personally. I caught up with them in Chile a few years ago. They left Chile and live in Oklahoma now. They abandoned the project. Yeah.
Are you allowed to say why, or is it?
Yes. Well, I can say why, because local Marxist criminals basically was holding them up at gunpoint, stealing their goods. They were held up at gunpoint twice in their own home. They couldn't own a gun for self-defense. Then the idea of moving to Chile for freedom seemed insane to them because the COVID lockdowns were out of control. And there was some kind of very minor, I think, bus fare fee increase or metro fee increase. And then half of Chile went into some kind of crazy riots about it. And then leftists who were agitators wanted to turn this into some kind of revolution or constitutional change. They couldn't handle it, to be frank. They just left. Yeah. So the wife told me that she wanted to have a gun to protect herself, and so she was happy. And the guy was from Canada. She was American, and they thought too. They said that Chileans looked at them like they were crazy for moving here versus the United States. Yeah.
Right. Huh. Okay. How about one more? You mentioned that you have a take on why the GOP outreach to the Hispanic community fails.
Yes, this is it's one of my favorite chapters, Bob. And I was actually at a GOP luncheon today discussing the election outcome, and we were chatting about it today. But when a lot has been made of the fact that Donald Trump supposedly got a majority of Hispanics, and when I heard that, I was suspicious, to be frank, that was the case. And it turns out that was a premature assessment. That more detailed assessment puts it at 42%, which is still better than George Bush and his predecessors. So I think Bush was the previous high point at 40%. And so there's a lot to say about it. And mate, to be frank, it's a fascinating topic because it's going to become more and more relevant. But I try to distill down as much as possible. And I say that there are two key reasons, I think, impeding Republicans, and it's almost baked in. It's almost impossible to get around these facts. So one is that the idea of constitutionally limited government in Latin America, it's basically not a thing. There's what's called wiki constitutionalism, and they just change their constitutions every other day. And it's just, they don't have either, like I said, Argentina is somewhat of an exception here, but they don't have the same constitutionally limited government ideal as the United States does. And most of the world does not, to be frank. Even New Zealand really doesn't. But so they if you talk to them about, let's say, a Tea Party, give them Tea Party rhetoric about decentralization or gun rights, they just won't get it. It'll just bounce off them because it's just so alien to them. It's just not part of their traditional history. And the other element is that because they are so much poorer, and like I said, it's about 85, by some estimates, even more than 85% less per capita income in Latin America, predictably, they will enter the welfare state when they arrive. And it's a bit like asking teacher unions to vote against public schools, right? It's very tough. If you've got a party that is in favor of limiting the welfare state and a demographic that is much more inclined, especially new arrivals, to be on the welfare state or in it, then you're pushing uphill. Basically, it's a really tough battle. And just because I'm familiar with Spanish language media, there's a sharp distinction. Now, this is not always the case. There are some Spanish language channels that appeal to more the Cuban exile community, but in general, the Spanish language media is incredibly. If you think MSNBC is bad, basically all the Spanish language channels are like that. It's not an accident that Jorge Ramos got into a spat with Donald Trump originally, and that he's basically the most prominent or successful Spanish language journalist in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, so you're explaining why their conventional methods aren't working. Do you have any advice for them, or is the advice just don't get your hopes up?
I do no. I have some advice. First, one of the key. So Hispanics, it's a difficult demographic, of course, because they're mixed. They're different ethnicities, and they come from different countries, and they've been here for different periods of time. So, of course, like I said, the exiles from communism tend to be more amenable to outreach, and then also people who've been here more generations. But there are some key little tidbits that if you were a GOP strategist, you could go after. So firstly, Hispanics outperform relative to their education level, and they have a much lower tendency to attend higher education or even to finish high school. Okay. But then they will then outperform other groups in terms of making money for their education level. So pushing higher education onto them, they obviously don't like it. Mm-hmm. So there are certain policies that if you were a GOP strategist and you were to say, this guy is forgiving student loans, why are you paying for all these, college graduates who are not you, basically? That would really resonate with them. We're out working the hard jobs, paying for them. We don't like it. So there are other issues too that, insofar as there are, this is a really sensitive topic, but there are, let's say, racial tensions. Latin Americans tend to be less politically correct. And if they feel like other groups are getting more handouts that they're not getting, they will not like it. So things like reparations for slavery, they will not like it at all. So there are certain policies that the Democrats have supported that are really not popular with Latin Americans or Hispanics in the United States. And that's why maybe it's one reason why Kamala failed, I'm not sure, but they had a really hard time keeping their so-called rainbow coalition together, because many of the policies, they have to basically cater to one group that another group just will not like. And this college loan forgiveness, to me, is absurd, because I know it's a great vote getter for the people who are in student loan debt, but other groups, if you were to bring this to their attention, would not like it at all.
Okay, yeah, that all makes perfect sense. Okay, well, why don't we wrap it up there? Do you want to hold the book up again?
Sure.
People who are watching the video.
This is the book, and I'd love people to send me feedback or disagree with me. I'm really open to different perspectives on this. The Latin America Red Pill, and it's La Píldora Roja in Spanish. So we've got a Spanish version on Amazon. And I know it can be controversial and people have different perspectives. A lot of other people, they are disappointed that I didn't give so much attention to U.S. foreign policy in the region, although I did give some attention. It's just that I saw U.S. foreign policy as relatively benign or almost neutral, in that there have been mistakes, plenty of mistakes, but I see it as largely a scapegoat for the challenges there, and I don't want to further contribute to that scapegoat.
Okay, well, great. So, folks, my guest has been Fergus Hodgson. Fergus, thanks so much for writing the book and coming here to talk about it.
Thank you, Bob. I admire your work and your show, and I'm glad. I appreciate the opportunity.
Oh, thanks for saying that. And thank you, folks, for tuning in. See you next time.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.